Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a stack of material here looking at recent developments around potential peace talks, regarding the conflict in Ukraine.
Right.
Our mission in this deep dive is really to cut through the noise, pull out the key info points for you from these sources.
Makes sense.
We'll explore the proposed memorandums, the differing views on how negotiations should even happen, and some of the wider geopolitical stuff.
Including perspectives from Russian President Putin and U.S. President Trump, but yeah, strictly based on what's in this material we have.
Exactly. So what's the immediate backstory here, according to these papers?
Well, what's immediately clear is the recent history. The sources mention a previous round of direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. That was in Istanbul back on May 16th.
Right, Istanbul. And after those talks, there was that big prisoner exchange. What was it, May 23rd to 25th?
Yeah, that's it. The sources describe it as 1,000 for 1,000. Pretty significant.
And then what happened?
Well, we learn that right after this exchange, Ukraine announced it had provided its version of a memorandum, laying out conditions for peace.
And who got that?
According to the information, it went to both Russia and the U.S.
Okay. So based on this material, what's the next step planned? Looks like another meeting.
It does. The material indicates Russia plans for its delegation to be back in Istanbul June 2nd for a second round.
And who's leading the Russian side?
We're told it's assistant to Russian President V.R. Medinsky. And they'll arrive with their project, their draft memorandum, plus some other proposals about a ceasefire.
Other proposals, interesting. But the sources don't actually spell out what those are, do they?
No, they don't. It's vague. And the information suggests Russia plans to present its memorandum during the meeting in Istanbul, not before.
Okay. And this is where we see a clear disagreement pop up in the sources, right?
Definitely. Ukraine insisted on reviewing the Russian memorandum before the meeting.
Why? What was the reasoning given?
To make sure the talks could actually be constructive. Ukrainian officials, like Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha, reportedly stressed they needed the document in advance so their delegation would, have the authority to actually discuss specific points.
Makes sense. You need to know what you're walking into.
Exactly. And what's highlighted is Ukraine accusing Russia of basically delaying the peace talks by not providing that memorandum ahead of time.
And how did Russia respond to that accusation based on the material?
Russian President Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, is quoted calling Ukraine's demand unconstructive, just flat out.
Unconstructive.
Yeah. And Peskov reportedly said the Russian memorandum cannot be made public.
Yeah.
But despite all that disagreement over the process, the material confirms the Russian delegation still expects to meet on Monday morning in Turkey.
So Russia brings their plan on the day, Ukraine wants it beforehand. What about Ukraine's own memorandum, the one they sent out? What do the sources tell us about that?
The material mentions it was presented to Russia and the U.S., like we said. And U.S. President Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, Kit Kellogg, apparently confirmed the U.S. got it.
And what was his take?
He described it as having 22 conditions, called them quite good and reasonable. That's the quote used.
Okay. Any more detail on what's in Ukraine's proposal?
A little bit. An anonymous Ukrainian official, cited in the sources, apparently said it includes provisions for a ceasefire, land, sea, and air, with monitoring by international partner.
International monitoring, got it.
Yes. And we also see that the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hakan Fidan, hosted a press conference with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Sybiha.
And Turkey's role?
Fidan is reported as saying Turkey is ready to organize another round of talks, calls them possible. But the sources don't give a firm date from that specific meeting, just that it's possible.
Okay, let's really dig into the core differences in approach here, because the sources point to something fundamental.
Yeah, you really do. What the material makes clear is the different priorities. It indicates Ukraine's primary focus is, well, first get a ceasefire, then move on to negotiating a bigger peace deal.
Stop the shooting first. And Russia, what's their priority, according to these sources?
It seems different. The sources suggest Russia has shown less interest in just a ceasefire itself. Instead, they keep saying they want to focus on addressing the, quote, root causes of the conflict.
Root causes. What does the Kremlin mean by that, based on the material?
Well, the material explains these are far-reaching demands, like a commitment that NATO will not expand eastward, that kind of thing.
So how does that framing land with Kiev and its allies, according to the information?
Not well. According to the sources, they view Russia's focus on root causes as more of a tactic aimed at, subordinating Ukraine.
A tactic? How so?
The material highlights concerns among Ukrainian officials that Russia might try to set a kind of trap during talks.
A trap?
Yeah, like presenting conditions they know Kiev absolutely can't accept. For example, demanding Ukraine give up territories it currently controls. And then, if Ukraine refuses, Russia blames them for disrupting the peace process.
Okay. That brings us to the broader geopolitical picture that the sources paint, and this is where it gets really layered, doesn't it?
It certainly does. What really stands out is the perspective attributed to Russian President Putin. The material describes him as, determined to end what he apparently sees as unacceptable encroachment by the West.
Encroachment on what, specifically?
On the geopolitical arrangements that came about after the Soviet Union dissolved. And the sources state that, from the Kremlin's point of view, NATO's ongoing expansion is seen as a direct threat.
A threat to Russian national security.
Exactly. And a primary source of instability in Eastern Europe, as they see it. The material suggests that for President Putin, defending what's called Russian depth is, it's presented as an existential thing, not just politics.
And restoring Russia's status.
Yeah, the idea seems to be that restoring Russia's status as a superpower, equal to the U.S., is worth a very high price. The sources explicitly connect the 2022 special military operation to this perceived geographical threat.
Okay, now how does the material portray U.S. President Trump's perspective in all this?
It's interesting. We see in the sources that U.S. President Trump, even though he sometimes uses tough language, is described as fearing the consequences of sort of cornering Russia.
So the idea presented is that isolating Moscow, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Or it's dangerous.
That's the implication drawn from the sources, yeah. According to the material, President Trump doesn't believe isolating Moscow is effective, and he thinks prolonging the conflict will just lead to more chaos and instability, especially in Eastern Europe.
What's the underlying message there?
The message drawn from the sources seems to be that Russia isn't an adversary you can just easily surround without facing, serious repercussions.
But the sources also note that President Trump recently accused President Putin of playing with fire and threatened new sanctions.
They do note that. But they immediately add the caveat that his statements about the Russian leader have varied quite a bit over many months. So it makes it unclear if these specific threats will actually be acted upon. It adds a layer of uncertainty.
Got it. And within this context, what about that comment from Trump's envoy, Kit Kellogg?
Yeah, that's an interesting detail from the sources. He's cited saying that Russia's concerns about potential NATO expansion eastward are fair.
Fair. Wow.
Yeah. And he apparently added that Ukraine's membership in NATO is not discussed.
And how did Moscow react to that comment, according to the material?
Reportedly, quite positively, Russian President Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, positively assessed Kellogg's comments. He's described as saying they were the result of negotiations between Russia and the U.S. during, quote, closed contacts.
Closed contacts. The sources even bring up history to frame these tensions, right?
They do, yeah. The material references the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, as a historical example of just how high tensions can get between Washington and Moscow.
And the lesson from that.
It's highlighted as a turning point. It showed how escalation between superpowers could lead to, catastrophe. The sources suggest that history showed world peace is protected more by mutual understanding and balance, not provocation. And that this lesson seems maybe even more relevant today.
So, okay, when we pull all these threads together, the diplomatic back and forth, the different core priorities, this whole geopolitical backdrop, the sources seem to express some pretty serious doubts about whether these talks will even happen or work if they do.
They certainly do. The material points out the reality on the ground. Russia is currently making advances in eastern Ukraine. They've opened a new front up north and increased strikes on cities.
And how is that interpreted?
Well, Ukraine and some Western leaders are cited in the sources saying these actions just demonstrate Moscow's lack of real interest in a ceasefire right now. Actions speak louder than words, essentially.
And these actions, they kind of cast a shadow over the diplomatic efforts we've been talking about.
Exactly. The material suggests that these diplomatic maneuvers happening while the conflict is actually intensifying, it creates doubts. Doubts about whether new negotiations will really happen and, whether they'd achieve anything significant if they did.
And yet, despite those doubts, the sources also seem to frame getting back to the negotiating table as, a necessity.
That's right. According to the information we have, returning to talks appears necessary for the stability of the international order. And the sources suggest Europe, in particular, stands to lose the most if it ignores those lessons from the past, like the Cuban Missile Crisis example.
So, thinking about everything we've just laid out, based purely on these sources, what really stands out to you about these different perspectives and priorities in the mix for potential peace talks? How does seeing all these points from the sources help you grasp the sheer complexity here?
And maybe building on that, considering those different priorities outlined in the sources, Russia's focus on root causes like NATO versus Ukraine wanting a ceasefire first, and then throwing in that historical perspective about managing superpower tensions. What kinds of challenges does this setup inherently present for actually finding a path to peace based only on the information we've looked at today?
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.